40 F-15 Eagles just landed in Poland, not for an exercise, not for a photo opportunity, for an indefinite deployment that NATO hasn't announced and Moscow definitely didn't see coming. These are fourth-generation fighter jets designed to win air superiority in any theater on Earth, and they just appeared 110 miles from the Belarusian border at a moment when Russia is already bleeding aircraft it cannot replace in Ukraine. This is not routine force rotation. This is the United States repositioning combat power in Eastern Europe on a scale it swore would never happen again after the Cold War ended. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we're covering the quiet reconfiguration of European security architecture that mainstream outlets are treating as a minor deployment story. I'm going to show you exactly why 40 F-15s in Poland represents one of the most significant shifts in NATO force posture since the alliance expanded eastward in 1999. We'll cover the specific capabilities these aircraft bring, what their presence means for Russian operational planning in any Baltic scenario, and why this deployment signals something far larger about how the United States is rethinking its commitment to European defense. By the end, you'll understand why the Pentagon just made a move that fundamentally alters the strategic calculus for any Russian planner looking at NATO's eastern flank. These 40 F-15C Eagles arrived at Polish Air Force Base Łask on March 8, 2026. The deployment came with minimal advance notice. No major announcement from the Pentagon. No dramatic press conference from NATO headquarters in Brussels. Just a quiet statement from European Command confirming the arrival of a fighter squadron for what they termed enhanced air policing and regional security cooperation. But the numbers tell a different story. 40 combat aircraft represents more American air power in Poland than has been stationed there at any point since Poland joined NATO in 1999. And these aren't training aircraft. The F-15C is the air superiority variant, built for one mission, destroying enemy aircraft before they can threaten Allied forces. To understand why this deployment matters, you need to understand what Poland's geographic position means in European security. Poland sits directly between Germany and the Russian exclave of Kaliningrad to the north, Belarus to the east, and Ukraine to the southeast. It's the critical buffer state that separates core NATO territory from Russian-aligned states. Any Russian military move toward the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, or Lithuania would require either crossing Polish airspace or skirting along Poland's northern border through the Suwalki Gap, a narrow 65-mile corridor between Kaliningrad and Belarus. This geography makes Poland the keystone of NATO's eastern defense. If Poland can deny its airspace to Russian aircraft, any Russian ground offensive toward the Baltics becomes exponentially more difficult. For decades, Poland has wanted a permanent American military presence beyond the rotational forces that cycle through NATO exercises. Polish leadership has offered to contribute billions of dollars to build what they've called Fort Trump, a permanent American base that would cement the security guarantee the United States extended when Poland joined NATO. The United States has consistently resisted, not because of Russian sensitivities, but because permanent basing in Eastern Europe would require congressional approval, significant infrastructure investment, and a level of commitment that multiple administrations have been reluctant to formalize. Instead, the United States has relied on rotational deployments. Units come in for exercises, they train with Polish forces, they leave. This creates presence without permanence. The F-15 deployment breaks that pattern. These aircraft aren't rotating through for a 6-week exercise. European Command's statement used the term indefinite deployment. That's Pentagon language for we're staying until further notice. And the aircraft aren't arriving into empty hangars. Over the past 8 months, the United States has quietly upgraded facilities at Łask Air Base. New hardened aircraft shelters, enhanced fuel storage, expanded munitions bunkers. These are infrastructure investments you make when you plan to keep aircraft in place for years, not weeks. Now let's talk about what 40 F-15Cs actually represent in military terms. The F-15C Eagle is the air superiority variant of the F-15 platform. It entered service with the United States Air Force in 1979, making it a fourth-generation design, but calling it old technology misses the point entirely. This aircraft has been continuously upgraded across its service life. The current F-15C fleet features AN/APG-63V3 active electronically scanned array radar that can track multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 100 miles. It carries AIM-120D advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles with active radar guidance and a range of approximately 100 miles, along with AIM-9X Sidewinder short-range missiles for close-in combat. The aircraft's maximum speed exceeds Mach 2.5, and its operational ceiling reaches 65,000 feet. But raw specifications don't tell you why the F-15C still matters in modern air warfare. The relevant fact is the aircraft's kill ratio. The F-15 platform across all variants has achieved 104 air-to-air kills with 0 losses in combat. Not a single F-15 has ever been shot down by an enemy aircraft. That record spans conflicts from Israeli operations over Lebanon in the 1980s to Operation Desert Storm to more recent Middle Eastern engagements. The aircraft combines exceptional radar, proven weapon systems, and flight performance that allows it to dictate engagement terms against any opponent. When Russian pilots see F-15s on radar, they know they're facing an opponent with every tactical advantage. 40 of these aircraft in Poland changes the air picture across the entire Baltic region. From Wask Air Base, F-15s can reach the Kaliningrad airspace in under 12 minutes of flight time. They can patrol over the Baltic states with enough fuel to maintain station for extended periods before returning to Poland for refueling. And most importantly, they can establish air superiority bubbles that make Russian air operations in the Western Military District dramatically more dangerous. Every Russian Su-30, Su-35, or MiG-31 that takes off from bases around Kaliningrad or St. Petersburg now faces the possibility of encountering American fighters with superior radar, better missiles, and pilots who train constantly for exactly this mission. This deployment forces Russia to rethink air operations across its entire Western approach. Before these F-15s arrived, Russian air defense and fighter coverage around Kaliningrad provided reasonable confidence that Russia could contest NATO airspace in any Baltic scenario. The S-400 air defense systems stationed around Kaliningrad have engagement ranges of approximately 250 miles against conventional aircraft, creating overlapping coverage with fighter patrols that could challenge NATO air operations. Those calculations just changed. The F-15s don't have to penetrate the S-400 envelope to matter. They can orbit just outside Russian air defense range and wait. Any Russian fighter that ventures out to patrol Baltic airspace now does so, knowing that American aircraft with better situational awareness and longer-range missiles are positioned to engage. Think about what that means for Russian operational planning. In any scenario where Russia moves ground forces toward the Baltic states, air superiority becomes the critical enabler for the operation. Russian ground forces need air cover to protect against NATO strikes on supply lines, command posts, and advancing units. Russian helicopters need freedom to maneuver for close air support and troop insertion. All of that requires denying NATO the ability to operate freely in Baltic airspace. 40 F-15s sitting in Poland make that mission exponentially harder. Russia would need to commit significant fighter resources just to neutralize the American presence, and every aircraft committed to fighting F-15s is an aircraft not available for ground support or escort missions. But there's another dimension to this deployment that makes it particularly significant. The F-15Cs in Poland are flying alongside Polish F-16s and conducting joint training with Polish pilots. This isn't symbolic cooperation. These are integrated air operations where Polish and American pilots practice coordinated tactics, share radar pictures, and develop the muscle memory needed to fight as a combined force. Polish F-16s are capable aircraft, but they operate with American-built radar systems and weapons that integrate seamlessly with F-15 capabilities. The two fighter types can share targeting data in real time, allowing Polish F-16s to act as forward sensors, while American F-15s hold back at longer range with their more powerful radars and longer-range missiles. This integration creates a force multiplier effect that changes the balance of air power in the region. Poland operates approximately 48 F-16C/D Fighting Falcons. Combined with 40 American F-15s, that's nearly 90 fourth-generation fighters operating from Polish airspace with full interoperability. For context, Russia's Western Military District operates approximately 120 fighter aircraft total, spread across multiple bases from Kaliningrad to Murmansk. Not all of those aircraft are fourth-generation equivalents, and many are committed to air defense rather than offensive operations. The sudden appearance of 90 integrated NATO fighters in Poland fundamentally shifts the correlation of forces. Step back and look at what this means for NATO's defensive posture. For the past 3 decades, NATO's approach to Baltic defense has relied on what military planners call the tripwire strategy. Small rotational forces from multiple NATO members maintain presence in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. These forces aren't large enough to stop a Russian offensive on their own. Instead, they serve as a guarantee that any Russian attack on the Baltic states would immediately involve killing American, British, German, and other NATO soldiers, triggering the Article 5 collective defense obligation. The assumption has been that deterrence works because Russia understands that attacking the Baltics means war with all of NATO, not just the small nations on Russia's border. The F-15 deployment suggests a shift from tripwire deterrence to denial deterrence. Instead of relying solely on the threat of escalation, NATO is now positioning forces capable of actually denying Russia the ability to achieve rapid military success in the Baltics. Air superiority is the foundation of denial. If Russia cannot control Baltic airspace, its ground forces become vulnerable to NATO airstrikes, its logistics become targetable, and the entire operational plan for a quick fait accompli in the Baltics falls apart. 40 F-15s don't make Russian operations impossible, but they make them far more costly and time-consuming, giving NATO more time to reinforce and potentially denying Russia the rapid victory that makes Baltic aggression thinkable in the first place. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting. This deployment didn't happen in isolation. Over the past 18 months, the United States has been quietly reinforcing its military presence across Eastern Europe in ways that haven't received significant media attention. In Romania, the United States doubled the number of rotational troops at Mihail Cogolnicianu Air Base, bringing total American personnel there to approximately 4,000. In the Baltic states themselves, the United States established a persistent rotational presence of Abrams tanks and Stryker armored vehicles that never fully withdraw. They just swap out crews. And now in Poland, 40 F-15s taking up what appears to be permanent residence. These aren't disconnected deployments. They're part of a coherent strategy to create defensive depth across NATO's eastern flank. The Pentagon hasn't publicly articulated this strategy, and there are good reasons for that discretion. Openly declaring a permanent military buildup in Eastern Europe would play directly into Russian propaganda about NATO encirclement and Western aggression. It would complicate relationships with European allies like Germany and France, who remain more cautious about provoking Russia. And it would require congressional debates about defense commitments that multiple administrations have preferred to avoid. So instead, the buildup happens through incremental decisions that individually seem modest, but collectively represent a fundamental shift in American force posture in Europe. But Russia sees what's happening. Russian military publications have been tracking these deployments with increasing alarm. Commentary from Russian defense analysts suggests they understand exactly what the F-15 deployment means for their operational planning. One Russian military blog noted that the appearance of American fighters in Poland effectively closes the air corridor that Russian planning assumptions had relied on for any Baltic operation. Russian state media has been less analytical and more bombastic, claiming the deployment proves NATO's aggressive intentions and threatening unspecified countermeasures. But beneath the rhetoric, Russian military planners are confronting a reality that makes their jobs considerably harder. The Russian response options are limited. Russia could deploy additional fighter aircraft to Kaliningrad, but that exclave is already heavily militarized, and additional aircraft would face the same problem. They'd be operating under the umbrella of American F-15s with superior capabilities. Russia could invest in more advanced air defense systems, but S-400 batteries are expensive, require trained crews, and still don't solve the fundamental problem that NATO now has combat aircraft positioned to contest any Russian air operations from day one of a conflict. Russia could threaten nuclear escalation, but using nuclear threats to respond to conventional fighter deployments would undermine whatever international support Russia retains. Every Russian option involves costs that don't change the underlying strategic reality. There's a broader economic dimension worth examining. Each F-15C costs approximately $50,000 per flight hour to operate when you factor in fuel, maintenance, and crew costs. 40 aircraft conducting regular patrols represents a significant sustained expense. The United States is making a choice to bear those costs indefinitely. That financial commitment sends its own signal. This isn't a temporary gesture. The United States is willing to spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually to maintain air superiority capabilities in Eastern Europe. For smaller NATO allies like Poland and the Baltic states, that commitment addresses their fundamental security concern. They've worried since joining NATO that Western European powers view them as buffer states whose security is negotiable. 40 American fighters sitting on Polish soil operating around the clock is the most concrete answer to those concerns the United States could provide. Polish response to the deployment has been overwhelmingly positive. Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz described it as a historic strengthening of the Polish-American alliance and exactly the kind of presence Poland has been requesting for years. Polish media coverage has been extensive and celebratory, portraying the deployment as validation of Poland's security concerns and proof that the United States takes Baltic defense seriously. For Polish domestic politics, this deployment is a major win for the current government, which has staked significant political capital on strengthening ties with Washington and positioning Poland as America's key ally in Eastern Europe. But NATO's response has been more nuanced. The alliance officially welcomed the deployment as a demonstration of NATO's collective commitment to defense. But privately, some European allies have expressed concerns about the precedent this sets. German officials in particular have worried that permanent American deployments in Eastern Europe could complicate broader European security discussions and make eventual normalization of relations with Russia more difficult whenever that becomes politically feasible. French officials have been characteristically focused on European strategic autonomy, suggesting that Europe should be developing its own capabilities rather than relying on expanded American presence. These tensions within NATO aren't new, but the F-15 deployment brings them into sharper focus. Now let's acknowledge what this deployment has not accomplished. 40 F-15s don't make Russian military action in the Baltics impossible. Russia retains significant military advantages in the region, including geographic proximity, established air defense networks, and the ability to concentrate forces quickly. In any conflict scenario, Russia could still create local superiority by committing enough resources. The F-15s raise the cost and reduce the probability of Russian success, but they don't eliminate Russian military options entirely. The deployment also creates its own vulnerabilities. Wask Air Base is approximately 110 miles from the Belarusian border. In any major conflict, that base becomes a high-priority target for Russian missile strikes. Russia operates Iskander short-range ballistic missiles from Kaliningrad with ranges sufficient to reach Polish air bases. The F-15s would need to disperse to alternate airfields or operate from hardened shelters to survive the opening hours of a major conflict. Concentrated air power is effective for deterrence and peacetime operations, but it creates lucrative targets in actual warfare. There are also questions about sustainability. The F-15C fleet is aging. The United States is in the process of retiring older F-15Cs and replacing them with F-15EX Eagles, a modernized variant with updated avionics and significantly extended service life. But the transition is gradual and budget-constrained. Maintaining 40 F-15s in Poland indefinitely requires either reducing F-15 presence elsewhere or accepting higher operational tempo for a shrinking fleet. At some point, the United States will face choices about whether to replace these aircraft with more modern platforms like F-35s, which would provide stealth capabilities but come with significantly higher operating costs, or whether to shift to a different model of European air defense that relies more heavily on Allied capabilities. From a Russian perspective, this deployment likely confirms their existing worldview about NATO expansion and Western intentions. Russian strategic thinking has long held that NATO is fundamentally an anti-Russian alliance that seeks to constrain and eventually destabilize Russia. 40 American fighters appearing in Poland fits neatly into that narrative. It allows Russian leadership to portray themselves as responding to external threats, rather than creating instability through their own actions in Ukraine and elsewhere. The deployment gives Russia a tangible grievance to cite when justifying military investments or aggressive posturing, even though NATO's expanded presence is clearly reactive to Russian actions rather than unprovoked aggression. The Baltic states themselves view this deployment as long overdue recognition of their security situation. Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian officials have been arguing for years that NATO's existing force posture is insufficient to deter Russian aggression. They've pointed to Russia's demonstrated willingness to use military force in Georgia in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, and Syria throughout the 2010s as evidence that deterrence requires credible capabilities, not just political commitments. The appearance of American F-15s in Poland represents partial validation of that argument. It suggests that American strategic thinking is moving closer to Baltic threat assessments, even if it hasn't fully arrived there yet. Look at what this reveals about American strategic priorities. For 2 decades, American defense planning has emphasized Pacific operations and the challenge posed by China. European security was treated as largely stable after the Cold War, requiring maintenance but not major new investments. That consensus is breaking down. The Russian invasion of Ukraine shattered any remaining illusions about European security being permanently settled. The F-15 deployment to Poland is one visible manifestation of a broader recalibration. The United States is hedging its strategic bets by reinforcing European commitments even while maintaining focus on the Pacific theater. This creates real tensions in American defense planning. The United States military doesn't have unlimited resources. Fighters deployed to Poland are fighters not available for potential Pacific contingencies. Pilots and maintainers assigned to European operations can't simultaneously prepare for operations in the South China Sea. Budget dollars spent on European base infrastructure are dollars not spent on capabilities designed for the Chinese military challenge. American strategists are trying to solve this dilemma through what they call dynamic force employment, the idea that units can deploy to whichever theater needs them most at any given moment. But 40 F-15s sitting in Poland on indefinite deployment suggests the limits of that flexibility. When you build the infrastructure to support permanent operations, those forces become increasingly committed to that theater. Here's what we should be watching for next. First, does this deployment expand? 40 F-15s is significant, but it's still just one fighter squadron. If the United States begins rotating additional squadrons through Poland or establishes similar deployments in Romania or the Baltic states themselves, that would indicate this is the beginning of a broader military buildup rather than a one-time adjustment. Second, how does Russia respond operationally? Words are cheap. The question is whether Russia repositions its own military forces, increases readiness levels around Kaliningrad, or makes other moves that suggest genuine concern about NATO's enhanced capabilities. Third, what happens with NATO infrastructure? If the United States is serious about sustained presence in Poland, you'd expect to see additional investments in airbase facilities, fuel storage, and munitions stockpiles. Those investments take time and money, but they're necessary for real operational capability. Watch whether Congress allocates funding for European Defense Initiative projects focused on Polish infrastructure. That would signal long-term commitment beyond the current deployment. Fourth, how do other NATO allies respond? Does this American move encourage countries like the United Kingdom or France to increase their own rotational deployments to Eastern Europe? Or does it create the opposite effect, where European powers feel they can free ride on American commitments and reduce their own defense investments? The alliance dynamics around this deployment will shape European security for years. And finally, what impact does this have on Russian behavior toward Ukraine? If Russia concludes that NATO is becoming more assertive in Eastern Europe, that could either deter Russian aggression or accelerate it. Russian leadership might calculate that they need to achieve their objectives in Ukraine before NATO becomes too strong on Russia's western borders. Or they might decide that the risks of confronting an increasingly capable NATO outweigh the benefits of continued Ukrainian operations. The deployment doesn't determine those calculations, but it's one factor Russian leadership will weigh. The fundamental strategic picture is this. The United States just made a move that significantly strengthens NATO's ability to defend the Baltic states and complicates Russian operational planning for any westward military action. 40 F-15 Eagles sitting in Poland represent concrete military capability that changes the balance of forces in Eastern Europe. This isn't the same as the massive American presence that existed in Cold War Germany, but it's the most significant American military commitment to frontline NATO states since the Cold War ended. The implications ripple through alliance politics, Russian strategic planning, and the broader reconfiguration of European security that's been underway since Russia invaded Ukraine. The deployment also reveals something important about how deterrence works in practice. Political commitments matter, but concrete military capabilities matter more. Poland has had American security guarantees since 1999, but 40 fighters that can scramble in minutes and establish air superiority over Polish airspace are worth more for deterrence than 1,000 statements about NATO solidarity. This is deterrence through denial rather than deterrence through punishment. The message to Russia isn't just that attacking NATO would trigger retaliation. It's that attacking NATO would fail to achieve military objectives in the first place because NATO has positioned forces capable of defeating Russian operations. That's a more credible deterrent because it doesn't require escalating to nuclear threats. It simply requires the mundane reality that Russian fighters can't operate freely when American F-15s are in the air. We're watching the quiet militarization of NATO's eastern flank unfold in real time, not through dramatic announcements or summit declarations, but through incremental deployments that collectively represent a fundamental shift. 40 F-15s appeared in Poland with minimal fanfare. That quiet arrival matters more than any number of press conferences, because it represents actual military capability deployed where it can shape outcomes in any crisis. The planes are there, the pilots are flying, the infrastructure is being built, and the strategic picture across Eastern Europe just changed in ways that will influence military planning and political calculations for years to come. If this analysis helped you understand why 40 F-15s in Poland represents more than just another routine deployment, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're covering the continued evolution of NATO force posture and Russian responses as they develop. This deployment is one move in a much larger strategic competition, and we'll be tracking every significant development.